I expected a polite visit, tea, laughter, the usual stories. Instead, my grandson's friend looked at me as if he'd found a secret, and one quiet question broke something open inside me. What followed was not what anyone would call scandalous. It was tenderness, honesty, and a moment of unexpected connection that left both of us different than we were that morning. Before I start the story, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which city are you joining us from? I remember the afternoon like a photograph left in the sun. Edges soft, colors a little too bright now that they've been held up to the light. My kitchen smelled of lemon and cinnamon. I'd baked a small cake the way my mother used to, the kind that never tried to be anything more than honest. The clock on the wall ticked steady, confident, as it always had. Outside, the maple trees along the street were finally cooperating with autumn, gold and brittle, shaking like old bones when the wind decided to dance. They arrived with laughter that belonged to another, faster world. My grandson was in that in-between age where the habits of childhood and the responsibilities of adulthood bumped awkwardly into one another. With him was Jonathan, the friend he talked about for weeks, the one he said had a different sort of calm. That struck me as an odd description for a man in his late 20s, but as soon as Jonathan stepped over my threshold, I understood what my grandson meant. Jonathan had a plainness that wasn't boring. There was nothing showy about him. A simple jacket, a well-worn satchel, hair a little too long at the collar. But his eyes? They were the kind of eyes that followed a thing with patience, like someone willing to learn the shape of an object by touch. He didn't crowd people with words. Instead, he listened, and that listening made space in the room. We ate in the dining room where the light came in thick and forgiving. My grandson flitted between topics like a child picking shells, but Jonathan sat at the corner of the table where the light hit his cheek and said very little. By the time coffee was poured and the cake was reduced to crumbs, the conversation had settled into a comfortable rhythm. I told a story about dancing with my husband in the small kitchen of our first apartment. They laughed, the kind of warm, surprised laugh that tells you you are passing something true down the line. Then Jonathan asked me a question so simple and so startling at once that the silverware paused in the air. "Do you ever wish for a different life?" he asked, and he did not say it in a flippant, hypothetical way, but as if he were asking about a stain on a shirt he wanted to understand. There are questions that come like rain, sudden, inconvenient, necessary. I felt my throat tighten. At 72, you think you have answered most of the important ones for yourself. You are used to the sound of your own regrets, the soft, private inventory of what you might have done. But a question from a young man, someone who could easily be my grandson's age, landed on me like a mirror held so close I could see the years in the creases of my face. I told him the truth, because what else is a kitchen table for if not truth? I told him about the husband I had loved until he wasn't there anymore, about the summers of small disgrace when money ran out before dignity did, about the two choices that always seemed to wait on the doorstep of my life, and how both had been taken from me in different ways. I spoke in fragments at first, the way memory gives you pieces, and then, because listening is a kindness, Jonathan leaned forward and let those pieces settle into his palms as if they were delicate things. "Do you regret your choices?" he asked softly. I surprised myself by admitting something I'd kept private for decades. I regretted the times I didn't say yes to myself. Not the big, melodramatic yes of abandoning responsibility or family, but the small ones, the course not taken, the trip not booked because someone else's plans were more important, the paintings I never finished because the house needed mending. Saying it aloud was like opening a window. The air that came in was sharp and new. Jonathan nodded as if he expected nothing less from the world and nothing more from himself. Then he did something I had long forgotten anyone did. He asked me about the small pleasures that had kept me afloat. "What made you feel alive?" he asked. "Not when you were young, but yesterday. What still does?" I told him, and the list was foolish and glorious. I told him about the first sip of tea in the morning and the way my cat, a fat, unapologetic calico, would curl on my lap and purr like a tiny engine. I told him the shape of the light in the late afternoon, the way it found the dust in the air and made it look like a galaxy. I told him how sometimes I would sit on the porch and remember voices, my mother's laugh, my husband humming as he washed the dishes, and that remembering itself could be like putting my hand on a wound and finding it had become a map. When I finished, Jonathan's mouth curved in a small, almost surprised smile. He touched the back of his own hand to his chin, a gesture of someone sorting through his thoughts out loud. "You make that sound, alive," he said, "even when you're speaking of loss." It wasn't a compliment wrapped in pity. It was an observation, clean and clear. The conversation moved, as conversations do, into territory neither of us expected. He told me about being 28 and feeling like the world expected him to be certain. He described a job offer across the country, the way the idea of leaving carried both promise and guilt. Guilt at leaving the small network of people who relied on him, promise in the blankness of a new city. He was precise in his fears, a fear of failure, yes, but mostly a fear of being untrue to himself. I found myself offering him counsel the way I'd once tried to patch my husband's shirts. Practical, perhaps old-fashioned, but honest. I told him that certainty is rare and often a luxury of youth pretending to be adulthood, that the path you choose will leave its own footprints, and you cannot predict every storm. I told him that regret is not the same as mistake. It can be a teacher if you let it. He listened as if I were reading from a map that had belonged to someone he loved. And then, when the sun had dipped low enough that the kitchen light seemed warmer by comparison, Jonathan did the most gentle, brave thing. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. I could write that gesture a dozen ways, and each would be true. It was not the touch of a lover or a casual familiarity. It was the touch of a person saying, "I see you." It was a touch that asked permission, and by the way I turned my palm up, was given it. My hand, which had been busy with dishes and gardening and knitting, and the modest, necessary tasks of a life, trembled. A simple tear slid down my cheek, not from sorrow alone, but from the startling realization that my life had not been invisible. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was small, as if he had pulled a thread he did not want to snap. Something in that moment relaxed inside me. It was as if I had been walking around a room with the lights off, and someone had switched them on. I saw my reflection in the window, an older woman with a soft mouth and eyes that had been sharp once, but now had learned a slow kind of mercy. Jonathan looked at that reflection too, not with hunger, but with curiosity and respect. He was young enough to admire without appropriation, old enough to be steady. We sat like that for a long time, hands clasped over crumbs and coffee rings, sharing stories that were not dramatic but were essential. The way my husband used to forget where he put his glasses, and the way he would laugh when he found them on his head. The time Jonathan slept through a tornado warning in a college dorm, because he trusted the way his roommate spoke with certainty. The small, ordinary acts that stitch a life together. When they left that evening, my grandson gave me one of those hugs that belonged to family, warm, quick, full of the kind of love that is sometimes clumsy, but always urgent. Jonathan lingered at the door for a moment. He turned, and I expected a polite farewell. Instead, he said something that unfurled in my chest like music. "You have a way of making room," he said. "I don't know why, but I feel like I can breathe here." It was not a confession. It was a truth as simple as the porch light on a rainy night. I told him to come again, almost on impulse, and meant it. I meant it because in the way he had looked at me. Carefully, gently, without the impatient glance of youth or the condescending pity of those who think they know history. I had seen myself reflected back as a person who mattered beyond her roles as wife, mother, grandmother. That night I sat in my favorite chair and watched the moon pull itself over the horizon. I thought about the way a single question had opened a door, and how the answer was less about who I had been and more about who I could still be. There was a tide going up and in, and for the first time in years, I felt the current moving in a direction I could choose. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I do know that an ordinary afternoon became a turning point because a young man named Jonathan looked at me and asked me something that cut past the usual niceties. He surprised me, and in surprising me, taught me that endings in one part of life can be beginnings in another. When you're my age, you collect stories the way others collect coins. They jingle when shaken, sometimes heavy, sometimes tiny. That day added a new one, a quiet, honest piece that I tuck gently into the pocket of memory. It does not erase the past. It colors it, gently, like the light through the kitchen window. If you're watching this, and you've ever been surprised into tenderness, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know which cities have the same light as mine. I woke the next morning with a lingering warmth from the day before, the kind that sits in your chest like a quiet hearth. The sun had barely reached the tops of the maples, and the air smelled of dew and faintly of wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. I poured myself a cup of tea and settled onto the porch swing, wrapped in my favorite shawl, thinking about Jonathan. It was unusual, this preoccupation. Usually, the world of visitors faded quickly after they left, like a guest who didn't quite belong. But his presence had left a trace, a small vibration in the spaces of my day, and it stayed with me. My grandson had called early, laughing as he reminded me about his next school project. "Grandma, you're acting like you have secrets," he teased. I smiled, letting him chatter on, and thought about Jonathan's quiet strength, the way he seemed to absorb the world rather than fight with it. There's a type of calm that is both disarming and comforting, and Jonathan had it in abundance. By the time they arrived again in the afternoon, I had baked another small cake, this time spiced with nutmeg and orange zest. The aroma drifted through the house, welcoming them in before they even opened the door. My grandson ran ahead, full of energy and chatter, while Jonathan followed at a measured pace, hands in his pockets, a soft smile on his face. There was an ease in him that made the room lighter just by existing in it. We sat again at the kitchen table, the autumn sun pouring through the windows and casting long golden streaks across the worn wood. Conversation started gently, meandering through topics like a quiet river finding its way around stones. My grandson had a school project involving local history, so we talked about the old town, the stories my husband used to tell, and the way small towns hold memory in the creases of their streets. Then Jonathan did something unexpected. He leaned forward, eyes steady, and asked me a question that made my heart flutter like a bird in a cage. "Emma, do you ever feel like you've been invisible, or that people don't really see you?" It wasn't curiosity for its own sake. It was precise, deliberate. It was the kind of question that recognizes the spaces in someone's life that even time itself often avoids. I felt a shiver run down my spine, not from discomfort, but from recognition. How could someone so young, someone who could have been intimidated by my age, sense this hidden truth? I took a deep breath, letting the words I had tucked away for years surface. "Yes," I admitted softly. "There are moments when it feels like the world sees the roles I play, but not the person I am. The mother, the grandmother, the neighbor, the woman who keeps a house together. Sometimes those labels cover everything else. And sometimes I wonder if I am fading into the background." Jonathan listened without interruption, nodding once, just enough to show he understood. His presence wasn't invasive. It was supportive, almost reverent. I realized in that moment that this young man, this friend of my grandson, had created a space where honesty could exist without fear. That was rare. That was precious. "I think," he said quietly, "that people like you, people who carry so much and still find ways to care for others, they don't get enough acknowledgement. But I see you, Emma, and I think that matters." My chest tightened, the kind of squeeze that makes you aware of every breath. I had not expected affirmation from someone so young. And yet there it was, offered freely without expectation, without obligation. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, quickly brushed away with the back of my hand. But Jonathan noticed, and he didn't look away. He simply remained there, steady, patient, giving me permission to feel. We talked for hours, circling around topics of memory, of loss, of fleeting happiness. He shared stories from his childhood about the challenges he faced, the ambitions he carried quietly, and the fears he kept close to his chest. I realized that in sharing our stories, we were weaving a subtle intimacy, a bond that was emotional, not physical, tender but not fraught with anything but genuine understanding. There was respect in every word, every glance, every silence. At one point, Jonathan asked, "Emma, what do you think it means to be truly alive at this stage of life?" It was a question that startled me because I hadn't framed it in that way before. Life had become a series of routines, necessary, predictable, comforting. But in that predictability, I sometimes wondered if I had lost the thrill of discovery. I thought about it carefully, weighing my answer in the quiet of the afternoon. To be truly alive, I said finally, is to feel something with intention. To recognize small joys, to accept pain without letting it diminish you, to be curious about the world and about yourself, even when it seems you've seen it all. It's daring to feel, daring to connect, daring to see and be seen. Jonathan's eyes brightened with a subtle awe. "That's beautiful," he said. "I think I'm starting to understand that, thanks to you." We shared a silence then, the kind that feels comfortable rather than awkward, filled with unspoken acknowledgments. I felt a warmth spread through me, not lust, not longing, but a deep, resonant emotional connection, the kind that fills the chest and softens the edges of the day. There was honesty in it, mutual recognition, and a subtle tenderness that lingered like the scent of my baking. Later, when my grandson wandered off to play in the yard, Jonathan and I lingered over the remains of tea and cake. He reached over, touching my hand lightly, and I didn't pull away. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a declaration of trust, of shared space, of a moment that mattered. The afternoon sunlight cast a halo around us, and for the first time in a long time, I felt seen, understood, and appreciated not for what I had done, but simply for who I was. As the evening approached, Jonathan and my grandson prepared to leave. I walked them to the door, feeling a mix of gratitude and melancholy. Jonathan paused at the threshold, his hand brushing briefly against mine again. "Thank you, Emma," he said softly, "for being honest with me, for letting me in. I won't forget this day." I smiled, tears threatening again, but this time of a different kind, relief, joy, a recognition of life's continuing capacity to surprise. "Nor will I whispered. "Nor will I." After they left, I stood in the quiet house, listening to the rustle of leaves outside, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock. I realized that the day had changed me in subtle but lasting ways. I had been reminded of the value of connection, of honesty, and of the simple power of being seen and acknowledged. I thought about Jonathan's questions, about the way he had looked at me, and about how courage sometimes comes in the form of a quiet inquiry rather than bold action. The day had been unexpected, deeply emotional, and profoundly gentle. And as I sat in the fading light, I knew that life still had room for discovery, for tenderness, for moments that leave your chest aching in the best way possible. Even at 72, the possibility of meaningful connection was not behind me. It was alive in the laughter of my grandson, in the quiet attentiveness of Jonathan, in the sunlight spilling across my kitchen table. Life had found a way to whisper once more, and I had listened, fully, openly, gratefully. I poured myself another cup of tea, the steam curling into the air like a soft promise. Somewhere in the city streets beyond my porch, other people were living their stories, feeling their own echoes of connection and discovery. I hoped they were listening too, hoping they were paying attention to the small moments, the unexpected questions, the gestures that matter more than words can say. And as night fell, I felt a calm settle around me, a certainty that even in the quiet, even in the ordinary, life could surprise you with kindness, understanding, and emotional resonance. That day, Jonathan had reminded me that the heart does not age in the way the body does. It remains capable of surprise, capable of growth, capable of opening to connection in ways both subtle and profound. I whispered to the empty house, "Thank you, Jonathan." And I meant it, knowing that some gifts are not measured in time or place, but in the sheer act of being truly seen.